think in general, the United States has been pretty slow or insensitive in understanding Russia's vulnerabilities. And actually, the, the, the issues that are prompting the current fighting in Ukraine have deep roots. I mean, it goes back to 2018 when NATO announced that they were going to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. But they weren't going to do it right away. There's this long process that you have to go through to get to a certain level of development of your policies to enable you to join NATO. But it was announced in 2018 that back then, Dick Cheney, the vice president, and the Bush administration were pushing hard to bring Georgia and Ukraine into the Western Alliance, into NATO, to deny them to Russia, to be a buffer zone between Western Europe and Russia. But they didn't really say, but there were understandings that in order for them to come into NATO, they were going to have to do a lot of work in terms of building up their military and building up their quality of governance. And the West European nations said, we also don't want to be bringing countries into NATO that have conflicted boundaries, that have ethnic conflict, that don't get along well with their neighbors. And I think that Putin looked at that and said, well, if my goal is to keep NATO from having a direct border with Russia, then the easiest way to do that is to send some special forces people into parts of Georgia and parts of Ukraine, get them to declare that they're breaking away from Georgia and Ukraine, making both of those countries having internal conflicts that would make them ineligible for joining NATO. So I think it's been a badly played strategy on the part of the West for, I describe it as sometimes taking the pawns off the chessboard, the Western Alliance snapping up Ukraine and Georgia, but not really offering them defense, because they weren't going to become full members of NATO until they had gone through a long process of meeting NATO standards.
Okay. How much of this has also like a cultural aspect, being that it's Ukraine, it's like Russian Kiev, the Bruce Kiev. Like, how much of this is also a struggle for the heart of a culture in some way? Is that an element of this as well?
Yeah, there's a strong element of that. Ukrainians and Russians are both Slavic peoples. In medieval times, it was one state. Initially, the capital of that state was Kiev. Moscow only came to prominence centuries later. But Ukrainian language is a Slavic language, but it's not the same as Russian. It's its own language. It's not just a dialect, it's an independent language, but they are related languages, just as French and Italian are separate languages, although they're related. And of course, Ukraine and Russia were both republics within the USSR. When the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, they became independent countries. And since 1991, Ukraine has really developed a much more of a westward leaning toward Europe path and ambition than Russia has. And there used to be a unified Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church, that covered the entirety of Georgia and Ukraine. And Ukrainian nationalism started to rise up after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And so the Ukrainian church is now broken away from the Moscow Orthodox Church, for example, and Ukrainians are proud of that. They're very proud that they're defining their own culture, their own values.
How much validity do you give to Putin's claim that Ukraine is still technically part of Russia? It was given away under Khrushchev just as a symbolic gift, but not really intended to be a permanent separate solution. Is there any validity to that claim?
Yes, there is some. In 1954, Khrushchev did take Ukraine that was part of Russia and created a separate Ukrainian SSR, Soviet Socialist Republic, within the context of the USSR. So they were all in the same country. It's just sort of whether the northern peninsula of Michigan is in Michigan or whether it's in Wisconsin, it's something sort of like that. Khrushchev himself was Russian, but he was from the westernmost parts of Russia. And during his earlier career, before becoming head of the Communist Party, he was first party secretary for Ukraine in the Ukrainian Republic. And so he had a real affinity for Ukraine. Back when I was a kid, in 1959, he came to Ames, Iowa, where I was born and raised, and he wanted to study hybrid seed corn because Iowa State University developed hybrid seed corn that you feed to pigs and cows and things, and they put on weight much faster, and so he thought that this was going to solve all of the meat problems in Russia. And so he had a real affinity for Ukraine. And so he carved off the Crimea Peninsula and gave it, which had been Russian under the Russian Republic, gave it to Ukraine. And now it's been set back. The population on the Crimea Peninsula is overwhelmingly Russian, ethnic Russians. About 65% of the population are Russians that don't want to be in a separate Ukraine. They want to be in Russia. And there are important military installations on the Crimea Peninsula. It's a large, huge naval base, bigger than Charleston. So they had a referendum. According to the official line in Moscow, 95% of the voters voted to not be part of the Ukraine and wanted the people living in the Crimean Peninsula wanted to be in part of Russia, going back to Russia. I don't really trust that 95% figure, but I think I'm quite confident that it was a majority. Back when they split, back when the Soviet Union broke up, there was a referendum in the Crimea Peninsula about joining, staying with Ukraine or joining Russia. Well over 50% wanted to go to be associated with the Russian Republic, but Gorbachev didn't want to fight. He said, the Soviet Union just broke up. We're going through so much right now. Let's not do this right now. Let's leave Crimea Peninsula, where it is, rather than fight that fight right now. So,
why has NATO expanded after the Cold War technically ended, or has the Cold War ended?
in some respects, the Cold War is still going on. It's just that the number of participants on the Western side has grown, and the number of participants on the Eastern side is diminishing. There are, of course, geostrategic and ideological and historical reasons why Russia, especially Putin's Russia, does not trust the West and thinks that power is is the only tool he has. He has some economic power with natural resources, but Russia has trouble feeding itself. It generates a lot of money from extractive industries, especially oil and gas. But the standard of living is far below that of most of Western Europe. And, you know, under Putin, at some times since the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia has tried to flirt with democratic reforms, and oftentimes those reforms didn't work out so well. And some Russians have come to the conclusion that democracy is just sort of chaos, and we need structure, and we need a strong leader that can tell us what to do.
So what what do you think Putin's goal is here? Like, what is his long-term goal? In some ways, when I look at the situation, I think, is he trying to right the wrongs that possibly he felt were done when the Soviet Union collapsed? Because I saw his television speech, and he was saying that in Western Ukraine, the oligarchs are taking over. It's corruption. They're a puppet of the West. So, you know, at least from the words that he's using, it appears that he's linking it to some of the things that were known to have happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. And I'm wondering if is he looking for redemption? Like, what's going on? Why this? Why now?
His language in his recent speech was flagrant and overly dramatic about the situation, or the way that he sees it, which is one of his oratorical styles. I have to say, his speeches are frequently like that. His overall goal, and that's the important question that you asked, what's he want? Well, he's been saying for 20 years that he does not want to have NATO countries on his borders, that he doesn't want NATO having the ability to threaten Russia directly on Russia's borders. He wants a series of countries to provide a buffer zone between Russia and the West. And he's been very, very clear about that. So no wonder it came as an inflammatory act when NATO leaders got together at the Bucharest conference in 2008 and extended an invitation in principle to Ukraine and Georgia to start down the road to become members of NATO. I say start down the road because they actually developed something called the membership roadmap program, where countries that want to get in NATO have to make certain reforms of their political and economic systems. They have to maintain order within the countries and all sorts of things. But it was announced early on that the NATO member nations were extending, in principle, an invitation to Georgia and Ukraine, but there were all sorts of conditions put on those, that they would have to engage in all of these internal reforms. They also, and actually, there were several important European nations, Germany, Italy, France, the Benelux countries, that all had grave reservations about extending that invitation to those two countries. In the document that they hammered out, they came up with a statement saying any NATO member nation has to promise to abide by the following kinds of conditions. If you can't have border disputes with neighboring countries. You have to treat ethnic minorities in your country in a just fashion, like you do any other citizen. You can't have disputed boundary disputes with outside powers, you can't have breakaway units within your regions. Well, I'm pretty confident. I would bet my family farm in Iowa that that Putin is aware of those conditions. And he thought, well, if my goal is to keep Georgia and Ukraine out of NATO, then I know how I can make that happen. I can send in little soldiers, green soldiers, we call them, little green soldiers with no insignias on their uniforms, send them into these countries, stir up non-Georgian, non-Ukrainian ethnic minorities in pockets in these countries to break away, to try to secede from Georgia, secede from Ukraine, and thus create internal breakaway units, thus disqualifying these two countries from ever getting in NATO.
What would be the incentive to escalate anything further at this point if he's already accomplished his goal by doing that?
That's a very good question, and I think it partly has to do with his psychology. In fact, I'm not sure he wants to escalate things any further. I've been watching the news today, and everybody's worried that he's going to go beyond where they currently are. The areas that Russian forces are assisting forces in now we're talking about Ukraine, not Georgia, in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, they are only in about a third of those two regions, maybe a half now of the territory of those regions is now in the zone that Russia is occupying and trying to subdue and so forth. There's still quite a bit of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine that don't have Russian military forces in them at the moment. So they could go there. If they go beyond those two republics into other republics or other areas of Ukraine, that would be a major escalation, and that would be all-out war with Ukraine.
Do you think it was wise or good policy for NATO to expand in the last 3 decades eastward?
In retrospect, no, I don't think it was a good, I think that some of the expansions were good. I think that leading Georgia and Ukraine, raising their hopes that they were going to get into NATO was irresponsible. Or if they were going to extend those, that they would do it absolutely without any public knowledge, without any announcements, without going public about it, by keeping it really on the down low. When they do it openly, and then when they also say openly, you can't have breakaway regions, you can't have contested boundaries, you have to treat your non-native ethnic groups in such a way, then it sends a very clear message. It's like an unintended consequence, or unintended consequence of their actions of doing that, that sends a signal to Putin, okay, if I want to really screw this up for them, then what I need to do is go in and stir interethnic trouble and messy boundary disputes and all sorts of things, and then NATO is not going to want to touch them. The people who were doing this and started this ball rolling back in 2008, the leader of the group was Vice President Cheney. Cheney was absolutely fixated on both Georgia and Ukraine. And the Bush administration that was going to be leaving in office after the election of 2008 was just, I was over there quite a bit, and you couldn't turn around without running into, not running into Dick Cheney, but hearing that he was in the country, and hearing in the country, having consultations, taking congressional members of Congress on site visits with him and all of that. They were doing a full court press trying to convince Germany and Italy and France and other NATO member nations that we wanted to get these two countries into NATO while we could, while Russia was weak, while we thought that we could, because they didn't know what the next administration was going to be or what they would want to do. And I think that was all very misguided in retrospect.
Um, what is are sanctions going to have any effect on this scenario whatsoever?
I don't think they're going to have a great effect. It partly depends upon what sanctions we're talking about. They've already postponed bringing the Nord Stream 2 big gas pipeline that goes to Germany. The Germans have shut that down. And so that's not a functional pipeline. The major pipeline that brings natural gas to Western Europe runs through Ukraine. That had been a source of tension periodically between the Ukrainians and the Russians because Ukrainians obviously charge transit fees for letting that pipeline have natural gas going through it, coming from Siberia across Russia and then feeding across Ukraine into Western Europe. And there had been struggles in the past between Ukraine and Russia over what those transit charges should be and whether Russia was really paying them or not, and Russia tried to build some pipelines that would go down through the Caspian to try to circumvent Ukraine because the reliability of their gas supplies to Western Europe was being called into question. So the suppliers were telling them, you know, we can't count on your gas coming through because Ukraine is kind of holding it hostage. So there had been some squabbles over that generally got worked out. So the digger we dig, the more we dig deeply into this, the messier it gets, I'm afraid.
How do you solve it without sanctions? Like, I mean, not that there's an answer, but I mean, how do you approach it without sanctions? Like,
I think that sanctions can work. I think that shutting down their access to international financial markets or lending sources is an important one. Shutting down the huge amount of money they get from the export of natural gas is a very important one. It'll certainly get their attention. But I think that there are some things for Russia that are just non-negotiable, especially for Putin. Putin is very much of a nationalist. He's all about Russian pride and beating his chest and flexing his muscles, and his portfolio since he became president was to instill stability and power and respect for Russia around the world. And the word respect, it could sort of be a synonym for fear. He understands that foreign countries respecting you means that they also are leery of you. They're fearful of doing anything to aggravate. So I think that, and he's an animal of the KGB. I met him, in fact, when I was a graduate student way back in 1976 in St. Petersburg, Leningrad. I was doing my dissertation research, Leningrad State University, and he had graduated from Leningrad State University Law School the year before. And I gave a talk in Russian on my research, and one of the professors brought him up and introduced him to me. And so I said, glad to meet you. He goes, duh. No expression at all, duh. And I said, so, all of this was in Russian. So I understand that you graduated from here a year ago. He goes, duh. I said, so where are you working now? And he says, I can't tell you. And of course, that told me, he was working for the KGB. But what was remarkable, the reason I remember this conversation, because the name, Vladimir Putin didn't mean anything to anybody back then. It was that he was 2 years younger than I am. So he was like 24 at the time, I guess. And he was just had no spark of life, no personality at all. He was like talking to a machine or something. Strangest conversation I think I've ever had, but that was my Putin experience.
What was your talk on?
My talk was on my research. I was doing research on how do citizens in the Soviet Union, how do they proceed if they have problem with the bureaucracies that govern their lives in the Soviet Union. So, for example, I was studying individual complaints that citizens would take to the prosecutor's office. They couldn't go to court and actually sue if their boss at the job wasn't treating them well or something, but they could go to the prosecutor's office. So one case that I remember, a woman came into the prosecutor's office and said, I work in this factory and my boss is making me work a 12-hour shift and it's the midnight shift and I'm pregnant. And it was a clear violation of the labor law, but the boss didn't care. And he's the boss, he was just telling her, you gotta come to work. Well, she was smart enough to know that this was a violation of the labor law and she couldn't go to court about it. So she went to the prosecutor's office and they had this special branch of the prosecutor that had reception hours where anybody that had some grievance or complaint could come to the prosecutor's office at the local level, lay out the facts. The prosecutor would look into it, and if he thought this was a justified complaint, pick up the phone and call the boss and say, you can't be doing this. This is a violation of the labor code. And this was the only vehicle that citizens at that time had in the Soviet Union for pursuing complaints. You want another case? Can I give you another case?
Sure.
A family in Leningrad had a young child that has some, I think was Down syndrome. I don't know exactly for sure, but had some mental condition or physical condition. And the nosy neighbor ladies in the apartment complex called the authorities and said, this young family that lives in the apartment complex with us has this child, and this child obviously needs to be institutionalized. And so the welfare people got called in and they went and were going to take the child from the home against the parents' wishes. And the parents felt that they didn't have any recourse really. So they went to the prosecutor's office and told them the story and said, the mother had a PhD in psychology and was a teacher. Father had a college education, was an engineer. They were intelligent people. They knew how to take care of their child. They had grandmothers that could come in and help them out. And so she laid out her grievance and the prosecutor said, yeah, there's no reason at all. They should have gone through more of a procedure to take your child away from you than just come in and snatch it because the nosy old ladies next door were, raising the issue. So I was studying those sorts of grievance procedures. But the funny part of that story is that the prosecutor's office had reception hours that, from 4 to 6, every afternoon or something, we have reception hours. Well, it was like an old time dentist office or something. You had the reception waiting room with these, vinyl chairs and, no carpeting on the floor. And it was pretty downscale. And these people would come in getting ready to meet with the prosecutor, and you'd look at them and one would have a setka, a string bag with 4 or 5 live chickens in it. And somebody else might have a big slab of meat wrapped up in cheesecloth on their lap. And they all, carrots, bags of eggs from their hens, they would all bring something. And, Americans hear that story and they always think it's this bribe, but it's actually more like showing respect, because this is what they do with their priests. In the Russian Orthodox churches, the priests were never paid, but their parishioners, when they would come for absolution for something they had done, they were expected to bring something showing respect to the priest. And so this is sort of the same sort of thing. So I was studying that whole phenomena, how in this heavily bureaucratic state do they have a pressure valve for dealing with citizens' grievances that arise through this massive bureaucracy of the Soviet state.
Was there lingering fear after the Cold War that kept the US from getting closer to Russia after it experimented in democracy?
Was there, what was it, fear of
Yeah, I'm just wondering, for
fear
the
here or
in
there?
in the US about, I mean, did it go away after the Cold War, or were there still lingering fears that in
Well, I
some
think there's
ways
still
prompted the
elements of,
expansion of NATO?
I think there's still elements in the American psyche of thinking about Russia. I mean, during my career, when I first, graduated from college and got my PhD and got a job in South Carolina and stuff, I would tell people that I was a Soviet expert, and they would sometimes give me a little gasp or something like, "Oh my God, what, what side are you on?" I think that people have come along, but I don't think Putin has certainly not helped things. Putin is a pretty scary individual. I think my little experience with him sort of bore that out, that this guy his wiring is unusual. And he's combative, he's short. I'm 5'8" when I stand up straight, and he's at least 2 inches shorter than I am. So he's a little bantam rooster, but man, he's just like a bantam rooster. He's very feisty, he's very determined to get his way. He's a kickboxing champion, and he does cage boxing and all sorts of things. A very strong ego and so he's all about leaving his mark on Russia, and he's done it for 22 years.
Do you think history will look at him kindly?
No, well, no, probably not. I mean, the history always looks at everybody with good and bad. And so there are good things to say about him, that he did stop the collapse, well, not the collapse of the Soviet Union as we knew it, but he stopped the collapse of the economy. He got the oligarchs that had taken over the most wealthy sections of the Russian economy. When things were privatized, they were privatized in a most unfair manner during Yeltsin's presidency. And so a few insiders became multi-billionaires like overnight, and one person captured the oil, or most of the oil industry. Another captured hydroelectric systems. Somebody else captured the shipping industry, the railroads. Russia was for sale there during the Yeltsin era, and Putin came in and stopped that. He put an end to that. He renationalized a lot of those things. And a lot of the average citizens actually welcomed that initially, because this was kind of revenge on the high rollers, the powerful magnates that had built mansions for themselves right there in Russia, but also owned property on the south of France or on the Adriatic or wherever. So people saw that wealth. During the Soviet days, very few people got really, really wealthy. The state was wealthy, but we didn't have the flaunting of wealth the way it was happening after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And the average citizen didn't feel like they were getting their piece of the pie. And Putin came in and drove most of those oligarchs out of business and nationalized their assets and spread the wealth a bit better by repaving buildings, building new buildings, housing, construction, renovating airports, concert halls, all sorts of public expenditures.
Okay. Do you think back met him occasionally? Just, I don't know, it's just like it's a pretty big meeting.
Pardon?
You think
Pardon
back
me?
when you met him in the past sometimes, like that instance in the past where you
Yeah,
met
when
him?
I met him,
Yeah.
no, I think about it not infrequently. Would imagine that he would remember me because it was pretty odd to have an American um, who spoke Russian, not like a native, but spoke it well enough that I could give a lecture to the faculty at the law school in Russian. Um, So, and it could have been an assignment. Maybe he was there out of interest to see this weird guy that showed up from the United States that was giving a talk about, citizens pursuing their grievances through our system. Or maybe, the KGB said, there's this guy, Gordon Smith, that's been at the law school for a year, and we think he's probably working for the CIA, but we don't know, and we want you to go meet him. You know,
Yeah,
I did have my encounters with with KGB that were, following me on occasion and tracking me.
what do you think of when you think back to that meeting? What about it do you recall or do you go back to?
Of the meeting with Putin
Yeah,
when I just first met him.
yeah,
Well, it wasn't very. The only remarkable thing about it was that he was so bottled up. I don't think he gave me a single answer about anything except for my last question, except for duh. Uh, and, and when he said, "Nimegu skazat," I can't tell you where I'm working, told me exactly where he was working. So, but it wasn't said with a twinkle in his eye, like this is, I have to say it this way because they don't want me to admit that I'm KGB. But, there was no twinkle in his eye. He was just a kind of a drone. He very plain, very unassuming. I, I, it was the weirdness of it that made me remember it.